Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate you all joining me this morning and having a conversation around this topic, right? As was previously mentioned, I have spoken at RSS many a times, and one of the things that I always try to promote is open communication, right? I can sit up here and go through the slides all day, but I always find it more beneficial if there's questions, comments, challenges, feel free to raise those to me as we're kind of going through this, right? The more interactive we can make this, probably the more successful it'll be for everybody involved. So with that, we'll kind of dive in here. As mentioned, I actually just recently moved to Echo Store about a month ago. Sorry. I'm a Rochester native. I've spent my career here. At the previous job that I had, I was responsible for the security practice for the Northeast and EMEA, right? So all of Europe. That allowed me to get a very good understanding of what is happening in the world, right? What are those trends? What are the things that organizations are trying to do? What are those problems that they're trying to solve? And funny enough, right, microsegmentation is not a new topic, right? It's been around for a very long time. People have looked at it in the past, you know, NSX and VMware and trying to get their hands around this whole concept of this east-west segmentation. I never really knew anybody that was able to adopt it early. Very few organizations kind of took the plunge. It was very complex, very expensive, right? And the more legacy kind of segmentation ruled out. Over the last, we'll say 10 to 11 months, and this is again global view, microsegmentation probably takes up 80 to 90% of my day. It is a tremendous topic that organizations are revisiting, and the goal is to, again, to try to reduce that blast radius. So I won't go through my little bio there, right? That was already done for me, but the thing that I really wanted to hammer home is I am not a seller, right? I speak to organizations from the Fortune 10 all the way down to smaller organizations and get to understand, again, what's working, what's not working, where are people trying to focus and what are they trying to solve for, and then kind of bringing that information back to the community, right? That's kind of my goal as a whole. So historical challenges, right? We kind of somewhat covered that already. Segmentation is one of those things where there's kind of three categories in my mind, right? There are organizations that don't have really any segmentation and they have a flat network. There are ones that have done it from a networking perspective with VLANing and internal firewalls and so on and so forth. And then again, there's that small pocket that have adopted microsegmentation. The third bucket there is growing by the day, right? Again, every organization that I've been speaking to, that term blast radius, I put that in the title on purpose, right? That is a buzzword. That is a thing that every CISO is looking at and every CISO is trying to solve for. And a lot of times those CISOs are rolling down to their team and say, hey, what are we doing around our blast radius? Do we know what the blast radius is, right? Sometimes we have an answer, sometimes we don't. But the messaging is, how are we going to reduce that? Like, we got to reduce that, right? The boards are coming down and saying we need to reduce our blast radius. It almost, in a way, I find it is that zero trust concept, right? Zero trust is a methodology. It is not a technology. There's technologies that fall into that zero trust mentality. But now with this term blast radius, right, we're almost taking a methodology and a strategy and trying to force it in without necessarily understanding the full picture of how are we going to do that. So from that traditional networking segmentation standpoint, right, again, I have seen organizations that have extremely locked down network segmentation. Can you guys hear me okay, or is there a bunch of feedback?
Yeah, it's just when you walk to this side.
All right, I'm going to stay over here then. You know, VLANing, right? There's organizations I work with where every floor of their building is a separate VLAN, right? Hundreds, if not thousands of VLANs that are out there. And what does that create? What do you think having that many VLANs is going to do to that IT team? Question back to you. Keep them employed, for sure, 100%. 100%. Nightmare and headaches, right? The complexity, the management of that becomes astronomical. To do a change is astronomical, right? The other component of this is, all right, well, I have all my VLANs, right? There's another organization I work with that all of their locations are VLANed. But that VLAN then in that location is a flat network. And they have their backups in a VLAN, but they're with everything else that's in that environment for that subsidiary, right? So how strong is that segmentation strategy? If your critical assets, they're VLAN, you can check the box, yes, I have segmentation, my backups are secure, but at the same time, anything on that VLAN can talk to that backup server, right? And there's no visibility of that east-west traffic. So from the complexity, the management, the change orders, right, and that visibility, network segmentation, traditional network segmentation becomes a real bear. As an organization grows, it becomes more and more complex. As organizations move from on-premise to the cloud, it becomes extremely complex, right? And what organizations were doing at that point is they were doing, again, the traditional network security on-premise, they moved to the cloud, and I'm gonna buy a tool, or I'm gonna buy Aviatrix, and now I'm gonna create segmentation in my cloud environment. Well, now you have two different segmentation strategies, right? Sometimes two different teams managing those two different segmentation strategies without any kind of connective tissue between each other. So you're essentially segmenting your own security practice, right? You're creating visibility into the cloud and controls on premise, but we're not able to see what the other ones are doing, right? Especially if those are two different groups, there's no commonality between the two, right? Where we have to focus on is doing a standard segmentation policy across the board, no matter if it's in the cloud, on-premise, subsidiary, wherever that is, right? That's how we really start to reduce some of that complexity and risk, because now we have common language, right? Common visibility and understanding of what's going on in those different environments. Any questions there? Anything that you feel like I left out of those bullet points? All right, either I'm nailing it or we're quiet today. All right, we'll go on. The other huge element, right? And this is where it starts to really get into the challenges around microsegmentation. And I can tell you countless examples of where, unfortunately, I see this. Yep, go ahead. Yeah, sure. I got that coming, but I can jump ahead, right? So essentially, microsegmentation is the east-west traffic segmentation, right? Application. What devices can communicate to what, right? So again, that VLAN example that we're talking about, right? Network segmentation traditionally is north-south, but it has no understanding of what's communicating east-west. So on that VLAN, like I was saying, that backup server is on that device. Your VLAN, so nothing can supposedly get in and out of that VLAN. That's not supposed to be. But then if something happens and one of those devices get impacted on that VLAN and they can communicate east-west, right? That's how infections spread, right? That's what the bad guys are trying to do. So microsegmentation specifically looking at that east-west traffic, making sure that your devices only talk to the things that they need to do their job, right? If you have an HR application, right? Does that HR application need to speak to the sales application? Probably not, right? So that's kind of the concept. The IT silos is still, right, as I said, I've probably spoken here 8 times. 3 or 4 years ago, I did a conversation around the modern IT team and how we needed to break down the silos and start to create kind of tiger teams to figure this out. Where segmentation and microsegmentation specifically starts to struggle is that those pockets, right? We're talking about with the cloud team and the security team and the networking team. There's always silos. I've seen improvement over the years. It's nowhere near as bad as it used to be, but it's still an issue. And where it starts to become the real problem of microsegmentation is a lot of times the networking team owns the tool, right? They own the care and feeding of that segmentation tool. And they need security to create the policies and procedures and standards of what they're going to segment, how they're going to segment, and what does proper access look like, right? So what occurs is, one, either security has all those things documented and created, but networking is dragging their feet or don't want to implement this new tool or manage this new tool, or vice versa. The networking team gets it deployed, it gets it out there, and now we're in monitor mode, but now I don't know what to do, right? And they're sitting there waiting for the information to be able to go off and create that microsegmentation strategy. It sounds trivial. It happens every time, literally, right? Because segmentation touches everything, right? Your business applications, your desktop devices, your server environment, right? Cloud environment. So if those different groups are not working together, it's going to be a lack of understanding, tremendous complexity, right? Delays in that strategy. And what happens when there's delays, right? That project gets a black eye, it potentially gets scrapped, or we end up tossing more money into it. So the idea of creating this open communication and understanding of what the goal is and what the business objective is and how is this going to reduce that blast radius is critical to get the buy-ins from the different IT groups. If it's not there, it's going to fail. And that standard and procedure aspect, right? That's a huge thing. That's foundational, right? That's table stakes. But again, how many times a project has been stalled around microsegmentation because the proper policies aren't there, right? And the proper standards aren't there. The problem, and this is kind of across security as a whole in my opinion, we as organizations find a gap, right? We don't have security here, we need another layer here. Countless organizations go and buy a tool, right? Whether that is a market leader in that space, name brand, right? I'm going to buy that tool to fill the gap. But my use cases weren't created yet, right? I don't understand why I'm doing this. I just know that I need it. So I'm going to go buy a tool, and then I'm going to figure it out afterwards. I'm going to try to implement my use cases into that tool once it's in place. Identity, I see this all the time in identity, right? You buy an identity tool, they start to try to deploy it, they start to try to put in their use cases, and it gets delayed, it fails, they find out that that tool does not meet their use case, and it becomes a nightmare, right? So where we have to shift our mindset, microsegmentation, security as a whole, is technology is a secondary step, right? Technology doesn't solve anything if it doesn't fit your use case, or you don't have the ability to manage and respond to what's happening to that technology, right? At the end of the day, it's like buying a car but never putting any gas in it. It's great, looks nice. You can check off the box and say I have a car, but you can't use it, right? So segmentation is critical because of the complexity, because of how much it touches, right? That's step one. We have to get our teams together. The risk of doing nothing. I thought these statistics were really interesting. And again, for my kind of real life examples of speaking to so many organizations, I felt like they hit the nail on the head, right? So 100% of IT professionals say, yes, segmentation is critical, it's important. 77% of those organizations don't have segmentation, right? Or they have very limited segmentation. 22% have deployed it, didn't think it was possible, right? Again, that idea of it's too complex, I'm never going to do it. Microsegmentation, in my mind, that was one of the things that held everybody up. They looked at it, it was too big, right? It was too much of a shift. It was too complex. Sounds great, but I don't have the time, resources, and we'd never be able to do it. My environment's way too complex, right? And then that's 67% who have not deployed network segmentation don't have the resources, considered it too complex, right? The problem with the flat network, right? I mean, obviously this is probably, a stupid comment, but just to be aware, because I've seen it happen, unfortunately, many, many times, is if there's an incident and you have a flat network, there's not much you can do to recover from that, right? And a lot of times those organizations are having to pay that ransom because these guys, they don't just start encrypting right away. They crawl your network. They look for your keys to the kingdom. They look for your backup server that's sitting there on that VLAN that touches everything else. And then they kick off the encryption, knowing that now I have your backups, you can't recover, and you have to pay me the ransom, right? So the risk is there. And the idea of do nothing might make your life easier at the time, might save you some money, but at the end of the day, again, cliche statement, but it's true, it's not a matter of if, it's when, right? And so how do we now reduce how much of an impact these attacks are going to have? So into that modern segmentation strategy. Before I move on, anything on that section, any questions, comments? Do you feel like that's accurate for the organizations you're in today? Seen a lot of head nods. Okay. Yep. 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 Yep.
using AI to reduce our never told IT, and they couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. They wanted to put a cell phone reception tower into my building. No.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyways, bottom line, breaking down those silos, I'm having meetings with facilities. How is IT touching? How is
Yep.
my network impacting your guys' ability to
Yeah.
loss prevention, et cetera?
Yeah.
Breaking those silos.
Yeah, the organizations I see that are most successful with that, I hate the term Tiger Team, but that's really kind of what they're calling it, but this kind of cohesive IT organization, right? And where it starts to become interesting is where they have a representative, they meet monthly, and they have somebody from security, networking, data center, even on the business side, right? How many times are we going and doing a project, but we have no idea what the business impact is of that project? Why are we doing this? I'm being told I have to do this, but I have no idea how that impacts the business, right? If we understood how that impacted the business, would that improve the way that we approach that project? Potentially, right? But then we also understand of the why, right? If you don't understand the why, how important is that to you, right? And why am I doing this is a critical question. So getting business involved in like facilities in these different groups that are outside of your traditional is extremely important. Security back in the day, right, almost could be siloed because it touched a very small thing. I have my firewalls, I have my endpoint, and I don't care about networking. Network doesn't care about me because we're not touching each other. That doesn't exist anymore, right? Security is everywhere. It's in every topic. It needs to be focused on everything. And now those networking groups are managing or owning their own security stack, right? So if we have these silos and they're owning a security stack, I'll tell you a quick story. There's a huge retailer, right? One of the largest retailers in the world that was overseas. They had 8 different CSPM tools, 3 different CIAM tools, right? 2 different container security tools. And I was speaking to the CISO and says, I don't know what to do. All these tools are pumping information back into my SOC. Everything owns a different risk score. I don't know what's real. I don't know what I should be focusing on because these silos and these different organizations with underneath that corporate umbrella had the ability to go and buy whatever they wanted to. Well, now the way the security market is, you buy a CrowdStrike license, for example, a Linux CrowdStrike license, you get their CSPM for free. So some organization under the corporate umbrella bought that, have CSPM, I'll turn it on, right? Because they didn't have that overarching strategy. They didn't have that committee of those individuals communicating what's out there, what are we going to use, what is my threat intelligence that I'm going to standardize on, and it created a mess, right? I appreciate the comments there and questions. So the need, why now, right? We kind of already somewhat discussed this. Our 4 walls are gone, right? I mean, they've been gone for a while, but obviously COVID really expedited that process. I work for a company out of Norwood, Massachusetts. I live in Honeyway Falls, New York, right? Where is my perimeter, right? It doesn't exist. The idea of applications and SaaS and all these different concepts coming into our environment that we don't really have control over, right? Or we don't have visibility into is critical. The other area is around zero trust, right? Zero trust, the concept has been beaten the ground. I'm sure every single one of you probably don't want to hear that title again. But where we focused as a community and marketplace is, okay, ZTNA, we're going to restrict access right on the user level. Well, the maturity scale, if you've ever seen it from zero trust, is that's step 1, right? Access is step 1. But then from there, how am I going to lock down my data center, my applications, very similar to how I did to my users, right? Jonathan Borgesen is in sales, so he can only talk to the sales application in Salesforce, and he can't touch any other corporate applications, right? Well, that's great, but if my data center, all those things can communicate to each other, or my network, all those things can communicate to each other, how strong is that zero trust methodology and policy, right? So this idea of segmentation is kind of that next step. Risk is also a critical thing, right? Unfortunately, it's not going away. It's only getting worse. So the idea of, again, getting our arms around and understand what I need to protect, where my crown jewels are, is more and more critical. So I kind of already touched on this, but again, I get that a lot. I'm in a conversation with an organization. They say, I have zero trust. Right? I'm doing ZTNA. I'm good. So I thought it'd be helpful to kind of show you the differences, right, of where we're talking about. Again, at the end of the day, it is really focused on the data center, right? I have organizations who are very segmented from a traditional network segment, and they are locked down from the DMZ and the network. But once it crosses that delineation line into that data center, it's wide open, right? Anything on that data center can communicate to each other. You're protected to an extent, right, because you're locking it down on the perimeter, but then what happens if something gets into that data center and they have carte blanche to go wherever they want to, right? That's where we got to start to change. And that's really, again, how it helps and complements your potential zero trust tools, right? Whether it's Netscope, Zscaler, whoever, right? There is a next step to that zero trust journey. It is not just access. There is this concept of device-to-device communication. Network segmentation versus micro, right? You have to still have network, right? Micro segmentation doesn't really work as well if there isn't some level of network segmentation. But again, the complexity. And what we're essentially doing is we are identifying what my critical devices are, or trying to devise what my critical devices are, and then throwing up a VLAN. And as we heard in the back, right, that organization had over 30 VLANs, and maybe they were using 4. The problem that probably happened is somebody created that legacy VLAN. That person left or no longer worked for the company. That VLAN's out there. Nobody knows what's on that VLAN. Nobody knows what the impact is if I then turn off that VLAN, of what's going to happen. So they stay out there and they get built. The other problem that I've seen, again, with this kind of new modern way of the IT works is containers, right? That container needs access out. And a lot of times we as security folks get a phone call from DevOps and say, hey, I'm releasing this container, it needs access to this, and it needs to reach out to the internet for this. We have no idea what that is, right? What is that container truly doing? And it goes out in the wild, and we create a policy in our firewall, our internal firewall, our network segmentation to create an exception for this container, right? Well, how many containers do some organizations have? Hundreds, right? So now we create an exception and an exception and an exception, and now our internal firewalls, our internal segmentation is Swiss cheese. And just like the VLAN example that I said before, we can't turn off that exception because we don't know if that container is still out there, right? What is that container doing? And if I remove that exception, what's going to break? So we leave it. And it just gets more and more complex, right? More and more lack of visibility to what's happening in the environment. Again, this has kind of been the topic all along, but this is a critical thing that I need to echo as much as possible. This concept of segmentation, right, whether it's network, microsegmentation, zero trust, right, is not a project. It needs to be a program. If we approach it as a project, it will fail, right? We need to have the committee of those different IT resources meeting on this and talking about what this looks like, right? We need to understand how that's going to reduce our blast radius, how are we going to improve this, the policy creation, right? The understanding of now what's happening with our environment. One of the really interesting things of why, again, I think microsegments started to take off is the idea of the application dependency mapping, right? Again, typically it's another blind spot for a lot of organizations. They have these applications out there, DevOps build them, and I don't know what those dependencies are. Right? Again, work with an organization who's moving from on-premise to the cloud, and they are struggling drastically with that process because they don't know what application can be moved because they don't understand those dependencies. So they try to move one, it fails, they pull it back down and continue on and on. These newer tools scan your entire environment, watch all the traffic, right? So it's able to map out how all your devices are talking today, all your applications, what are those dependencies? So outside of that security element, again, where I was talking about how there's value in security tools or there's connective tissue between security and network and all these different things, how valuable is that information to the organization, right? To be able to do that mapping and understand how all of my devices are out there, what devices are out there, and how my applications communicate, and what are those dependencies of that application. If that organization I was seeing that was struggling to move to the cloud had that, right, how much quicker would they be able to do that project? But they didn't create it as a program, right? Siloed information. Security team owned it. Application team didn't know that functionality existed, right? So we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. The other valuable thing with this, and again, one of the reasons why I think it was slow adoption, is the fear of breaking something, right? Okay, I'm going to put microsegmentation in there, and I'm going to shut down business, right? I'm going to segment something or break communication to something, and it's going to have a negative business impact on my organization. That's a serious thing, right? I saw it when NAC first became a thing. Well, what happens if I kick my CEO off the network, right? Where the microseg is now, I think, becoming more and more relevant, more and more important, is the understanding of you create the policy in plain text, right? And then you can test it in monitor mode. So before you go live with that policy and put it in production, you're going to see what that new policy is going to impact out of the gate before ever doing it, right? It takes away the risk. It takes away the fear of breaking something, because you're going to see if it will break something and what will it break, right? And then you can start to weigh the risk. Okay, is this policy really what I need, or do I need to alter, right? And again, the idea of doing this now from on-premise and the cloud and having that all done under the one umbrella, right, with the same common policy and the same common language is huge. Because now those are the kind of tools that creates that cohesive group, right? Because now you have a platform that multiple different IT organizations can use within your company. Cloud team can use it, security can use it, networking can use it, application can use it, right? That's where those silos really start to impact the improvements of this. Unmanaged devices is an area that, again, I wanted to highlight because there's still somewhat of a gap there in some regards, right? We all have unmanaged devices, all of us, right? Some of them have more than others, OT, tremendous amount of unmanaged devices, right? But we all have IoT devices. Healthcare is another one. Tremendous amount of devices out there that we can't put an agent on, and we don't necessarily understand what that's doing, and we're going to try to VLAN it off and try to create protection. But they have an IP address, right? Some of them have internet access. So where the new trends are around this unmanaged device, right? So microsegmentation typically is you put an agent on your server, right? Or you put it in your virtual environment, and that's your enforcement point, right? So that's what's saying, yes, this device can talk to this device because that agent is making that decision. Unmanaged devices, you can't put an agent on. So now this is where the networking layer starts to become more and more critical, right? A lot of organizations have visibility tools to uncover those IoT devices, right? Whether it's order or metadata, whatever it is. So now you can take that feed of information, pump that into your microsegmentation platform. So now you have the visibility and understanding of what devices are out there. You can create the policy, but then you have your network layer at your switch become the enforcement point of how do those communicate, right? Most companies don't think about their unmanaged devices out of the gate. One, they don't think they have as many as they do, right? Or two, it's low risk, right? I don't really care. I need to protect this. That is always the second step in the journey, right? Okay, I have microsegmentation. My data center is locked down, but I have all these unmanaged devices, and what's the answer for that, right? So again, one of those areas I really wanted to make sure to highlight here, because it's something that we have to put thought in from the get-go, right? And it's not a secondary thought, because if we're going to have a true segmentation strategy, these are the things that we need to understand and address out of the gate. And again, that operate and optimize. The ability to monitor, understand everything that's out there, understand the impact of once we go live with this, once we push out policy, huge, enormous value, right? And if you're doing microsegmentation and you don't have that capability, it's something to think about, because that takes away a lot of that risk and concern. So again, I won't go through all these, but at the end of the day, right, there's a lot of different benefits to the microsegmentation aspect. Stop lateral movement is really the one that we're talking about most here today, but from a compliancy standpoint, right? When we start to think about that segmentation strategy, I know that the topic right now is mainly around microsegmentation and traditional network segmentation. But there's so many other aspects to that, right? We need to segment our data, our sensitive data, our unstructured data. We need to understand where that is, right? We need to segment off our backups. We need to be able to have that immutable backup in case something bad happens. So we have to start to think about segmentation instead of just pockets, right? Just one layer, and start to look at all overarching security program is how am I segmenting my environment with these different capabilities and different tools. If I can't segment my data, if I can't have control over my data, right, then what's the blast radius if somebody compromises my data? Segmentation will do part of that, right, because it will restrict who has access to that file share, but it won't save the problem, right? So we have to start, again, in my opinion, my humble opinion, what do I know, right? But at the same time, like I said, I get to see a lot. We have to start to think of our security program less about the holes in the dam and where my gaps are, right? And start to think about this more holistically. And at the end of the day, we're trying to protect our data. We're trying to limit access, right? We're trying to provide visibility across the environment and make sure that only the proper access is approved across the board. Well, that goes outside of just the network, right? That goes, again, to the data, to the cloud, to all these components. And if we don't have that answer around segmentation, around all those different things, we're leaving ourselves vulnerable, right? So this is a journey. Really what we're talking about is, in my opinion, almost like step one, step two of that segmentation journey. But this is why that program aspect is critical. It is not a project. It is not a deploy and forget about it and move on to the next thing and put our finger in the dam over here, right? It is how am I going to leverage this universal segmentation strategy across my environment, across my security stack. So again, reduction of the blast radius. So again, nothing new here, right? 2024, 35 global breaches, right? 5.4 billion records were exposed in privacy. 3.1 billion in fines. Why? Right? At the end of the day, how is this continuing to happen? We have advanced in our security controls. We have every tool, right? I don't know of a single organization that doesn't have security tools in place. They might not have as many layers as others, but they all have something. But we still are getting breached. Our data is still being exfiltrated. We're still paying ransoms. And our brand is being tarnished because we're in the news with an incident, right? And we have to change the way that we do this. We are never going, again, we're never going to stop it, obviously, right? It's the matter of when, not if. But how are we going to reduce how much the impact is? The other value of this, right, if you can't prove what was impacted by that event, then you have to pay as if everything was impacted, right? So your fines could potentially be double, triple what they potentially need to be if you can't prove what the bad guys had access to and what they didn't, right? Again, where segmentation really starts to come into play. And again, that data strategy really comes into play. So again, we talked about this quite often. Again, it's somewhat table stakes, but it's true, right? We have to restrict access. That segmentation piece is just a part of the puzzle. Like I was saying with these CISOs coming down and saying, I need to reduce my blast radius, it is not just a single thing that we can do to reduce that blast radius. We have to look at it holistically and the different components. Segmentation will help drastically, obviously, but we need to restrict our access, right? We have to have that strong segmentation strategy, again, not just pockets, but across the organization, cloud, on-premise, data, so on and so forth, right? Monitor all the systems. Again, to me, this is one of those biggest challenges, right? Is everybody has tools, nobody has enough people, nobody has enough time in the day. Those tools are producing alerts, right? If you don't have the ability to respond to that alert or understand what that alert is, what's the value of the tool? I say it all the time, right? There was an organization a few years back that they had 3 alerts in the middle of the night from their endpoint detection. Their engineer on staff got woken up, bells were going off, and they didn't have the ability to respond, right? It took them hours to realize that they had those 3 alerts. Well, what value is that tool then, right? The tool is only as valuable as the information that it produces that can be responded to. I don't care about what that tool blocks, right? It did its job. What I need to be concerned about is what is making it through and what is raising a suspicious flag that says, hey, something's wrong here, you got to look at it, right? And unfortunately, that's still an issue that organizations have today, is that understanding of what that information is, how quickly can I respond to it, and how quickly can I remediate it, right? Any questions so far? Any other questions? Yep, go ahead.
In terms of getting started in microsegmentation,
Yep.
is it like the traditional risk-based approach, your highest risk assets, start there, or is there anything more to it, or can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, for sure. So really, yes, because some of these tools are not cheap, right? They are very expensive. So the problem with doing, the good thing and bad thing, we'll call it, right, from starting small is one, it will save you money, but you potentially are only protecting 10% with this concept, right? The idea of where to start, in my opinion, is not identifying these are the applications I need to protect. It is the why do I need to protect them? What is the impact for me to protect them? And what is the impact to the rest of the environment for me protecting them, right? Again, building that foundational level and having those communications. Because what you might think is critical or what's labeled as critical, business might say, well, wait a minute, right? Here's my revenue driver, right? Here's my customer application that drives 90% of my revenue. I need to have protection around that from the other applications, right? So again, doing that understanding and discovery first is key. Then from there, you create your standards. But yes, as you roll this out, typically, there was a very large healthcare organization in Connecticut, right? And I think there are 52,000 employees. It took them about 3 years to fully get microsegmentation out there, right? But they did that foundational element, right? They understood what needs to be done. Then they addressed their critical devices. Really, Epic is a huge application for them, right? So try to lock down Epic as much as possible and these other components. And then they kind of started to filter out, right? Now, okay, my critical assets are covered. Now I have all these unmanaged IoT devices, right? The insulin pumps, the heart monitors, all these different things. So now what is my segmentation? How am I going to create microsegmentation around those applications and start to build out, right? So I think from your question, I probably answered it the longest way I possibly could, is doing that workshop, right, that internal workshop with those key stakeholders to understand the goal, right? What's the impact going to be? What are those critical devices, both from a business standpoint and an IT perspective? Create the policies and standards of what this is supposed to look like before you deploy, monitor, right? Understand truly, again, those dependencies. If I enforce something on this application, what's going to break downstream? Create that policy, push it out, break, not break, move on to the next set of components that are lower risk, right? And start to work your way from inside out at the end of the day. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Yep.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around the whole micro segmentation thing. So basically, though, you've got, let's say all these different applications or servers and stuff all on one potential VLAN,
Yep.
like a flat VLAN, let's
Yep.
call it. But then you're running agents then on each of the servers, the workstations, and that's what's really kind of controlling how they can talk to one another. Like it's not at like a switch level or something.
So here's where it gets muddy, right? So the ones who do it the best today, in my opinion, are agent-based, right? Because you just have that control. Where the marketplace is going is agentless. So the switch becomes the enforcement point, right? Arista, Cisco, they're all kind of coming out with this new concept of segmentation through software with a module that sits on the switch, right? The tried and true method today is kind of a hybrid, in my opinion, right? You have the agent, that's going to lock it down, that's going to give you the full visibility, that's going to be able to map out all those dependencies, so on and so forth. But then you also then be able to take the feeds from third-party tools to then inject the ACLs into that switch to now become the enforcement point, right? Where the agent comes into play is because that's the enforcement point, right? That is what is controlling that policy that says server A can talk to server D. Well, that agent's the one making the decision, is this server A or is it not, right? So, okay, it is server A, I'm going to allow access. Not, I'm going to block, right? The other kind of valuable thing with that agent, the switch layer, somewhat I would say, is you get to see all those things that are acting abnormally, right? So you blocked it, right? But you also get that alert. If you go back to what I was saying before, and the tool is only as valuable as what you can do with the information. So now you get the information that, hey, server A is acting really weird. It just tried to reach out to server G. It has never done that before. I blocked it, but just an FYI, here's how it's communicating abnormally, right? So now you can go isolate server A with a click of a button. So now you're cutting off all communication to everything else, right? So you're starting to get that granularity control over those different devices of how they communicate. Where the switch layer really starts to come impactful is OT, right? Because you can't deploy an agent, right? So those OT environments is really where I see a lot of the newer generation segmentation tools, where it's all at the switch level. Any other questions? Yep.
So from like a governance perspective, where do you see successful organizations assign ownership of the
Oh, great question.
minimum requirements?
That is a fantastic question. To me, it's risk. Risk owns it, right? Where I have seen the biggest impact and the biggest success, risk owns it, GRC feeds it, network owns the tool, and cybersecurity is using the information being produced by the tool, right? Where the struggle becomes, right, if we go back to those silos, where I've seen the struggle is they don't have the overarching umbrella of risk, right? That's sitting on top. So you have security or network that's responsible for one aspect of the deployment of this, and they're busy, they're not working well, and it stalls, right? So you can't have this be run by a single org in that environment, in my opinion, right? Networking cannot just own it and make the decisions and push it out and control it. Similar to security, right? Neither one of those understands the other world good enough to be able to manage this completely. So risk sits over it, identifies, again, what those critical devices are, what is my risk level, what do I want to try to protect at first. GRC creates those standards and policies and procedures around what this is supposed to be, how it's supposed to be operated, right? What is the recommended policy if something were to happen? How am I going to respond to that? And then security uses telemetry coming from that, right? As something new comes on, they're able to identify that and create that isolation. If an incident happens, being able to isolate that infected device as quickly as possible, and then networking, owning the tool itself is typically the way that I see this run appropriately. I think there was one other question. Oh, go ahead.
Is the private VLANs are more than the way to use for segmentation?
Say that again, sorry?
Private VLANs?
Uh-huh.
Is that the way to use more segmentation?
So it adds value to the VLAN, right? There is areas outside of that where there's not VLANs typically that still provides it because you have that device control, right? Most organizations won't get rid of their VLANing. It's just the way that it is. But now we can put that microsegmentation in that pre-existing VLAN and get that visibility of the east-west traffic, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, but in the virtual environment, how does NDX use microsegmentation?
Yeah, so host, same thing, right? So VMware came out with NSX, and in reality, VMware created the concept of microsegmentation, and it started off in the virtual environment, right? And modern trends is just moving more to physical environments. But you essentially put those agents on the host, and it operates the same exact way, right? In that agent on that host, you decipher what is proper communication, who should have access to this, and then it locks down east-west communication between that virtual environment.
Okay, so in virtual environment like VMware or
Citrix, yeah,
it's agent-based,
correct.
not like
There are software-based, soft-based tools in there. Typically, again, that virtual environment, again, nobody wants an agent, right? So depending on how you're configured, what your appetite is for that, there are solutions out there that creates that agentless, right, software-based. That becomes easier in the virtual environment than the physical environment, obviously, because you're doing software on top of software, right? But again, right, if we think about back in the day, that one organization that I said that got hit, that was used by their vCenter vulnerability that they had, right, that they couldn't update. That was there that the bad guys knew about. And they didn't have the proper steps to make sure that they protected that virtual environment, and they brought down their entire VMware, right, to the ground. So again, having that segmentation, again, VLANing, physical, IoT, virtual, cloud, right, that's where that holistic view of segmentation needs to come into play. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Yep.
Yeah, I was curious if you've been seeing any sort of, how's the
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. So it really depends, obviously, right? If you're doing an external penetration test, you're not going to see it, right? You're just testing your firewalls and your perimeter security. Internal, for sure, right? The problem with penetration tests is typically we're giving them an IP range, right? So we're not necessarily looking at the entire environment a lot of times. There are new platforms out there that are continuous pen testing, which I really like a lot. Unfortunately, they don't check the box for compliance. But essentially, they take known methods of what hackers are doing to break into your environment, right? And they run that constantly within your environment to test your segmentation, to test how deep can I go, what is your blast radius, and then it creates a Visio diagram of all the different hops of how they did it, right? And I'm going way off topic now, but again, it's part of that segmentation concept, right? It's almost validating what you're doing. The interesting thing about those platforms is we as organizations do a vulnerability scan. I have 3 level 9s. I got to fix those right away. But that doesn't give you any context where those level 9s sit, right? So at the end of the day, is that level 9 internet facing? Who has access to that level 9? And that level 3 is the thing that's going to bite you. So with these penetration tests, these continuous penetration tests, they give you a vulnerability score and show you, yes, I was used that risk level 3 that sits on your DMZ to be able to get in. Right? I got to John Borgesen's device, I scraped his credentials, I moved east-west over here, was able to hop here, get there, right? So you're able to, again, to get that picture. And then also validate, is my segmentation truly working? Am I blocking it, right? Are they able to get in that VLAN and communicate to my backend server, right? So all interesting stuff. But yes, for sure, the penetration test. Traditional is not a very good indicator because, again, we are dictating what that IP range is that they're going to do the penetration test on, right? So we already covered this. I know I'm out of time. Again, why I think this is becoming a topic, right? Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, they are pushing out guidelines of federal agencies implementing microsegmentation and the adoption of that, right? So again, expanding the viewpoint of this. Below that is kind of an example of what we're talking about here, right? Of how we're breaking this down, what's communicating, how we dictating what communicates to what. And then I saw that, oh, I think there was a picture. I'll go back for you can take a picture there. That last visual, I didn't create, I can't take credit for it, but I thought it did a really good job of what we're talking about, right? Again, microsegmentation is not going to stop the infection. What microsegmentation is going to do is contain the infection, right? Without it, we're toast, right? With it, we can indicate what are my least risky environments, part of my environments, what are my most critical. I'm going to layer everything I got possibly can on my critical. The least, if it happens, the impact is less, right? And now if an event does happen and the auditors come in and the threat hunters come in, I can say, here's exactly what was impacted by this attack, and here's why I know that this was impacted, right? So security blanket insurance policy. These are also things that help with insurance premiums because now you're being able to validate, yes, I have control, yes, I can reduce my blast radius, right? Also helps with third-party risk assessments. A lot of other values. So that was it. I think I might be right on time here.
We are right at 10 minutes to 11. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for being good.